The arena smelled like burnt metal and sweat as Cadet Alara Vance stood in the center of the massive combat floor. Her chest rising and falling with each heavy breath she took after the fight that had just ended. Around her lay the broken remains of 12 combat drones, their mechanical bodies torn apart and scattered across the floor like the pieces of a puzzle that would never be put back together. She had destroyed every single one of them within the time limit that the Galactic Union had set for the combat trial, and she had done it with nothing but her fists, her training, and the desperate hope that this time would be different for humanity. Her knuckles were split open and bleeding, the red drops falling onto the white floor of the arena and creating small patterns that looked almost artistic in their randomness. A bruise was forming on her jaw, where one of the drones had managed to land a hit before. She had ripped its arm off and used it as a weapon against the others, but she had won. And that was what mattered, or at least that was what she had thought until Examiner Vorithka stepped forward, with his datapad in his clawed hands and his expression showing nothing but cold disappointment. Vorithka's was a silvering, one of the oldest and most respected species in the Galactic Union, and he had been conducting combat trials for over 400 years. His body was covered in iridescent scales that shifted colors when the light hit them at different angles, and his tail swayed behind him as he walked with the confidence of someone who had seen thousands of candidates come and go behind him. Seated in the elevated observation deck behind thick reinforced glass sat the other 3 examiners who had been watching the entire trial. There was a Thornaki representative with his massive armored body and 6 arms folded across his chest, a crystalline Accord member whose body seemed to be made entirely of living glass that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows, and a Mendari collective observer with her soft fur and 4 eyes that blinked at different times. These 4 beings held the future of humanity in their hands, and Alara had spent the last 3 years of her life training for this moment. She had pushed her body beyond what she thought was possible, had learned combat techniques from a dozen different species, and had studied every single rule and regulation of the Union military integration process. All of it had led to this arena, to this trial, to this moment where she stood covered in her own blood, but victorious over every enemy they had sent against her. Cadet Vance, Vorithka announced in his hissing voice that his translator device turned into cold and clinical English. "You have failed the combat trial." The words hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment she could not speak or even breathe properly. "What do you mean I failed?" she finally managed to say, her voice coming out rougher than she had intended. "I destroyed every drone within the time limit, and I completed every objective you gave me." Vorithka looked at her with what might have been pity if his species had been capable of such an emotion. "You took damage," he said simply, gesturing with one clawed hand toward the blood dripping from her hands and the bruise on her face. A candidate for Tier 3 combat certification must complete the trial without sustaining any injury whatsoever. He paused and let those words sink in before continuing. "Your species' fragility has once again proven itself to be incompatible with Galactic Union military standards, and therefore Earth's application for military integration is denied." He looked back at his datapad as if the matter was already settled and forgotten. "Again," he added. And that single word carried the weight of every failure that had come before. This was humanity's 9th attempt at military integration in 12 years. And every single time they've been turned away for reasons that seemed to change with each new application. First, it had been that humans were too slow compared to other species. Then it had been that their reflexes were not sharp enough. Then it had been that their bones were too easy to break. And now it was that they could not complete a combat trial. Without getting a few scratches, Alara wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. Wanted to grab Vorithka by his scaled shoulders and shake him until he understood. what humanity was capable of when they were given a real chance, but she knew the rules better than anyone. And she knew that arguing with an examiner would only make things worse for the next human who tried to earn their place among the stars. So she bowed her head and clenched her fists at her sides, feeling the blood squeeze between her fingers as she tried to accept another defeat. It was in that moment of silence, with her head bowed and her spirit crushed, that she noticed something strange. The observation deck had gone completely quiet in a way that felt wrong somehow. She lifted her head and looked up at the 4 examiners behind their reinforced glass. And what she saw made her blood run cold for reasons that had nothing to do with her injuries. They were not moving, not in the way that people stop moving when they are being still and quiet, but in the way that people stop moving when something has gone very wrong. The Thornaki examiner's 6 arms had fallen limp at his sides, and his massive head was tilted at an angle that looked painful. The crystalline being had stopped glowing with their inner light and sat dark and motionless in their chair like a statue made of dead glass. The Mandari observer's 4 eyes were all closed at the same time, which Alara knew from her studies was something that should never happen while a Falad Mandari was conscious, and the 4th examiner, a species she did not recognize, had slumped forward onto the console in front of them. "Why are they not moving?" Alara asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as a new kind of fear began to replace the disappointment she had been feeling. Vorithka's turned to follow her gaze, and she watched as his scale shifted to a darker color that she had learned meant alarm in his species. His translator device clicked several times, as if it was struggling to process his reaction. Before any words came out, "That is not possible," he said. But there was no confidence in his voice anymore. "This facility has the most advanced security systems in the entire sector, and no one should be able to breach the observation deck without triggering a dozen different alarms." As if the universe had been waiting for him to say those words, the arena's lights flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The darkness that followed was absolute and terrifying, lasting for 3 heartbeats before the emergency lighting kicked in and bathed everything in a deep crimson glow that made the blood on Alara's hands look black. She looked at Vorithka's and saw her own fear reflected in his ancient eyes. "Something is very wrong," she said, and somewhere in the depths of the facility, she heard the sound of an explosion. The crimson emergency lights painted everything in shades of red and black as Alara and Vorithka stood frozen in the arena, their eyes locked on the motionless figures behind the observation deck glass. Vorithka's was the first to move, reaching for the communicator device attached to his belt with hands that trembled slightly despite his 4 centuries of military experience. He pressed the activation button and held it to where his ear would be if Silverine had ears in the same place as humans. Nothing happened. He pressed it again, harder this time, and then a 3rd time, before finally accepting what Alara had already guessed. "The communications are dead," he said, his translator struggling to keep up with the fear that was creeping into his voice. "Someone has blocked all signals from this facility." Alara looked up at the observation deck again and noticed something she had missed before in her initial shock. There was a faint haze in the air around the unconscious examiners, a thin mist that was slowly being pulled away through the ventilation system now that she knew to look for it. "They have been sedated," she said as her training kicked in and pushed the fear to the back of her mind where it could not interfere with her thinking. Someone managed to get a gas into the environmental controls of the observation deck. "That should be impossible," Vorithka's repeated. But this time, the words sounded hollow and meaningless even to him. "And yet it happened," Alara replied, her eyes scanning the arena for anything she could use as a weapon if it came to that. "Which means whoever did this knows this facility very well and has been planning this for a long time." She grabbed a piece of metal from one of the destroyed drones testing its weight in her hand and finding it acceptable. We need to get to the examiners and make sure they are safe. And then we need to find a way to call for help. Varithkas nodded and reached for the ceremonial sidearm that hung at his hip. The one weapon that examiners were allowed to carry during official trials. It was more of a symbol than a real weapon, but it could still fire 3 shots before needing to be recharged. And 3 shots were better than nothing. They had taken exactly 4 steps toward the observation deck stairs when the main doors of the arena exploded in with the blast, sent chunks of metal flying through the air like deadly rain. And Alara threw herself to the ground just in time to avoid a piece that would have taken her head off if she had been standing through the smoke and debris. Came figures that made her heart sink even further into her chest. She recognized them immediately from the intelligence briefings she had studied during her training, from the warnings that Earth's military had shared with anyone who dreamed of traveling beyond their home system. Victari Reavers. They were insectoid creatures that stood on 4 legs and used 2 more as arms. Their bodies covered in dark, chitinous exoskeletons that could stop most small arms fire. Their heads were dominated by massive mandibles that could crush bone with ease, and their compound eyes reflected the red emergency lights like dozens of tiny mirrors. Each one of them carried a plasma rifle that hummed with barely contained energy, and Alara counted at least 30 of them pouring through the ruined doorway. Vectari were pirates who operated in the lawless space beyond Galactic Union borders, known throughout the galaxy for raiding remote facilities and taking prisoners who could be ransomed back to their governments or sold to the highest bidder. They targeted places just like this one, isolated outposts with valuable hostages and minimal security because the Union had grown complacent after centuries of peace for Earth. Cass raised his ceremonial sidearm with steady hands despite the fear that his color-shifting scales betrayed. But he never got the chance to fire one of the Vectari. Soldiers crossed the distance between them faster than anything that Sai should have been able to move, slamming into the ancient Silverine with enough force to crack the wall when his body hit it. Vorithkas crumpled to the floor, his scales showing cracks from the impact that leaked a fluid that was probably blood. And his sidearm clattered away across the arena floor. Alara moved to help him, but 3 more Vectari surrounded her before she could take more than 2 steps. Their plasma rifles pointed at her chest from 3 different angles. The leader of the Reavers approached her with slow and deliberate steps, larger than the others with mandibles that clicked together, and what she had learned was the Vectari equivalent of laughter. His translator device buzzed and crackled as it struggled to convert his clicking speech into words she could understand. "Human," he said, and the words sounded like an insult in his mechanical voice. "Soft creature, weak creature. You will bring less ransom than the others because your species is not valued by the Union." He leaned closer, and Alara could smell something rotten on his breath that made her want to gag. "But you will still be useful as labor if no one pays for your return." Alara stood very still as the Vectari soldiers bound her wrists with energy cuffs that hummed against her skin, watching as more of them climbed the stairs to the observation deck and began carrying the unconscious examiners down like sacks of cargo. She watched as they kicked Vorithkas aside when he tried to rise, breaking more of his ancient scales with their armored legs. She watched as they laughed and clicked their mandibles at each other, so confident in their victory that they barely bothered to guard their prisoners. And she thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. 12 years of humanity trying to prove themselves to a galaxy that saw them as weak and fragile and unworthy of standing beside the other species. Among the star's 9 failed applications, each one rejected for a different reason that always came down to the same thing: in the end, humans were not strong enough, not fast enough, Not tough enough to matter in a universe full of beings who could crush them without effort. She thought about the drones she had just destroyed, about the blood on her hands and the bruise on her jaw, about all the pain she had endured to get here only to be told that it was not enough. She thought about her family back on Earth, who had sacrificed everything to give her this chance, and about all the other humans who were counting on her to open a door that had been closed to them for so long, and something changed inside her, something old and primal that lived in the deepest parts of her human brain, something that her ancestors had carried with them across the plains of Africa when they had chased their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, something that had allowed her species to survive ice ages and predators and every other challenge that the universe had thrown at them. The fear did not go away, but it became smaller, less important. A voice in the back of her mind that she could choose to ignore. She smiled, and the Vectory leader tilted his head in confusion at the expression. "I think there has been a misunderstanding about what humans are," she said quietly, and then she began to plan. The energy cuffs around Alara's wrists hummed with a soft blue light as she stood among the Vectory soldiers, her head bowed in what they assumed was defeat and submission. They had made a mistake that predators throughout history had made when dealing with humans, assuming that because she was smaller and weaker and bound, she was no longer a threat. The energy cuffs were designed for species much stronger than humans, with magnetic locks that required tremendous force to break and energy fields that would shock anyone who tried to slip out of them. But the Vectory had not accounted for the fact that human wrists were smaller than most galactic species, or that human joints could bend in ways that other creatures could not manage without injury. Alara had been studying her restraints from the moment they had been placed on her, noting the gap between the cuff and her skin, calculating the angle she would need to fold her thumb to slip her hand through. It would hurt, probably dislocate something. But pain had stopped being a barrier for her the moment she had decided that she was done being seen as weak. The Vectory leader had moved away to supervise the collection of the other prisoners, leaving only 2 guards watching her, while the rest focused on carrying the unconscious examiners toward the ruined entrance. 2 guards with their attention split between her and their companions, their rifles held loosely, because what threat could a single-bound human possibly pose? She made her move. Her left hand came free from the cuff with a wet pop that sent a spike of pain shooting up her arm. But she did not let herself react to it beyond a slight tightening of her jaw. The first guard turned at the sound, but by the time his compound eyes had focused on where she had been standing, she was already inside his reach. Her free hand grabbed the barrel of his plasma rifle and shoved it upward just as he pulled the trigger, sending the shot into the ceiling where it left a smoking hole in the metal. At the same time, her other hand came free from the remaining cuff and drove into the soft joint between his head and thorax, hitting the bundle of nerves that she had learned about in her xenobiology classes. The Vectory made a clicking sound that might have been surprise or pain, and then collapsed as his nervous system temporarily shut down from the strike. Alara caught his rifle before it hit the ground and spun to face the second guard, who was just starting to raise his own weapon. She did not give him the chance to use it. 3 shots from the stolen rifle hit him in rapid succession, each one finding a gap in his chitinous armor that she had identified while they were binding her. He fell backward and did not move again. The sounds of combat had alerted the others, and Alara could see the remaining Vectory turning toward her with their weapons raised and their mandibles clicking in alarm. There were still over 25 of them, and she had 1 rifle with an unknown number of shots remaining. Any sensible person would have found cover, tried to hold them off, waited for rescue that might never come. But humans had not conquered their world by being sensible, and Alara was done playing by rules that had been designed to make her fail. She ran toward them, not away, not sideways, but directly at the cluster of armed pirates who was still trying to process the fact that their helpless prisoner had just killed two of their soldiers in less than 5 seconds. Her rifle fired as she ran. Each shot aimed at the eyes or joints or any other vulnerable point she could identify on the closest enemies. She did not try to kill them all with gunfire because that would be impossible. But she did not need to kill them all. She just needed to get close. The first victory she reached was still raising his rifle when her boot connected with one of his front legs, shattering the joint and sending him crashing to the ground. She used his falling body as a stepping stone, launching herself over his companions and landing in the middle of their formation, where their numerical advantage became a liability. They could not shoot her without risking hitting each other. And in close quarters, her smaller size became an asset rather than a weakness. She moved through them like water, never staying in one place long enough for them to coordinate an attack. Using pieces of the broken drones as improvised weapons when her rifle ran dry, a sharp piece of metal became a blade that severed the tendons in a reaver's arm. A drone's power core became a thrown explosive that scattered 3 more. The rifle itself became a club when there were no more shots to fire. They hit her. Of course, a plasma bolt grazed her shoulder and left a burning wound that smelled like cooked meat. A mandible caught her leg and left deep gashes that immediately started bleeding. An armored limb struck her ribs with enough force to crack at least 2 of them. But she did not stop. She could not stop. Because stopping meant dying and dying meant failing. And she had been failing for too long somewhere in the chaos. Vorithkas had regained consciousness and was watching from his position against the cracked wall. His ancient eyes, which had witnessed 4 centuries of warfare across a dozen worlds, could not believe what they were seeing. He had studied humans, had read their combat assessments and physical evaluations, had seen the data that proved they were one of the weakest intelligent species ever to develop space travel. The report said that humans had slow reflexes compared to most predator species, that their bones broke more easily than those of other beings, that their unprotected flesh could be cut and burned and damaged by almost anything. All of that was true. And all of it was on display as he watched Alara fight blood from wounds that should have stopped anyone. Her movements were desperate and unrefined compared to the elegant martial arts of the Silverine. And every hit she took left visible damage on her fragile body. But she would not fall. Every time a blow landed that should have ended the fight, she got back up. Every wound that should have slowed her down seemed to make her fight harder. It was like watching something that refused to acknowledge the reality of its own limitations. A creature that had looked at the universe's rules and decided that they simply did not apply in 7 minutes. 18 Vecturi lay dead or unconscious on the arena floor. Alara stood in the center of the carnage, swaying slightly on her injured leg, her breath coming in ragged gasps that sent pain shooting through her cracked ribs. The remaining 12 Reavers had retreated to the observation deck, taking positions around the still unconscious examiners with their weapons pointed at the helpless hostages. "Stop!" the new commander screamed. Younger than the one she had killed early in the fight, and clearly terrified by what he had just witnessed. "Stop now, or we will kill them all. Every single one of them." Alara stopped, not because she was afraid, and not because she had given up, but because she needed a moment to think her shoulder was a mess of burned flesh that she could not feel anymore, which probably meant nerve damage. Her leg was leaving a trail of blood with every step she took, and every breath felt like knives in her chest. But the fight was not over, and she was not done yet. "Okay," she said, and her voice was surprisingly steady for someone who looked like she should have been dead 3 times over. "Let us negotiate." The young Vecturi commander stared at her with something that looked very much like fear in his compound eyes. He had come here expecting easy prey and valuable hostages, and instead he had found something that his species had no word for. He had found a human. The standoff stretched across 6 of the longest minutes of Elara's life as she stood at the base of the observation deck stairs, looking up at the 12 remaining Vectori who had positioned themselves around the unconscious examiners. Her body screamed at her with every breath she took, sending waves of pain from her cracked ribs and her burned shoulder and her slashed leg that would have put anyone else on the ground. But she had learned a long time ago that pain was just information, a signal from her body that something was wrong. And she could choose what to do with that information. She chose to ignore it. The young Vectori commander kept his plasma rifle pointed at the Mandari examiner's head, his mandibles clicking in a rapid pattern that his translator could not keep up with. He was scared. And scared enemies were dangerous because they made bad decisions. But they were also easier to manipulate if you understood what they were afraid of. The situation is very simple, the commander finally managed to say through his translator, his mechanical voice cracking with stress. You will surrender yourself as a prisoner, and we will take the hostages and leave this place. And everyone who is still alive will stay alive. Elara nodded slowly, as if she was considering his offer, buying herself time to observe the positions of his soldiers and look for weaknesses she could exploit. That is one option. She agreed. But I have a different idea that I think you should consider. You have no leverage, the commander snapped. You are one human with no weapons and many injuries. And we have 12 soldiers and 4 valuable hostages. Actually, I have something better than leverage, Elara said. And she took a single step onto the first stair. Every Vectori rifle in the room swung toward her, and she could hear the hum of power cells charging to fire. I have information that you need to hear before you make your final decision. She paused and waited until the commander made a gesture for her to continue, his curiosity overcoming his fear for just a moment. You came here expecting easy prey. Elara continued, taking another step as she spoke. Your intelligence told you that this facility had minimal security and that the species inside were soft targets who would surrender without a fight. Another step. Your intelligence was correct about everything except one thing. The commander's mandibles clicked nervously, but he did not order his soldiers to fire. Your intelligence did not account for the fact that there would be a human here. She was halfway up the stairs now, close enough to see the fear in the young commander's compound eyes, close enough to smell the chemical signals that Vectori released when they were panicking. Let me tell you something about my species that the Galactic Union databases do not include in their files. She stopped climbing and stood perfectly still, her bloody hands visible at her sides, her injured body swaying slightly, but her eyes locked onto the commander with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step backward. We are not the strongest species in the galaxy. And you were right about that. There are dozens of species that could crush us with their bare hands. The Vectori soldiers exchanged glances, confused by this admission. We are not the fastest species either. Your soldiers proved that when they caught me earlier, and I will not pretend otherwise. She smiled, and something about that smile made several of the pirates shift uncomfortably. We are not even the toughest species. As you can see from all the blood I have lost in the last 10 minutes, she gestured to her wounds, to the trail of red she had left on the stairs behind her. But here is what you need to understand before you decide how this night is going to end. She took one more step. And this time, none of the Vectori tried to stop her. Humans are what our scientists call persistence predators, which means that our ancestors did not evolve to be faster or stronger than our prey. Her voice dropped lower, and everyone in the room leaned in slightly to hear her words. We evolved to never stop chasing them, to follow them across miles and miles of land until they collapsed from exhaustion, to keep going long after any sensible creature would have given up. She looked at each of the 12 pirates in turn, making eye contact with every single one of them. I have already killed 18 of your soldiers tonight. And I did it while wounded and outnumbered and armed with nothing but pieces of broken drones. The commander's grip on his rifle tightened. Now I'm going to give you a simple math problem to solve. And I want you to think very carefully about the answer before you tell me what you have decided. She pointed at the hostages behind him. If you kill those examiners, you lose your only protection, and then I will come for every single one of you. She pointed at herself. If you kill me first, some of you might survive, but I promise you that I will take as many of you with me as I possibly can. And based on what happened downstairs, that number is probably higher than you want to think about. The observation deck had gone completely silent, except for the hum of emergency systems and the ragged sound of Alara's breathing. So here is my offer, she said. You leave now, you take your wounded, and you never come back to this sector again. And in exchange, I will let you walk out of here alive. The commander made a sound that his translator could not interpret. If you do not take this offer, I will make you regret it for the rest of your very short lives. She smiled again. And this time, there was blood on her teeth from where she had bitten her tongue to keep herself focused through the pain, because I promise you, on everything that my species has ever accomplished, that I will not stop, I will not surrender, and I will not die until every single one of you has paid for what you have done here. Behind her, Vorithkas watched from his position against the wall, his cracked scales aching but his mind completely focused on the impossible scene playing out before him. The human was barely standing, her body broken in at least a dozen places, facing enemies who could kill her with a single shot. And yet the Vectri were the ones who looked afraid. He understood now why the Union's assessment criteria had failed to capture what humans truly were. Because their tests measured strength and speed and durability, things that could be quantified and compared. But there was no test for this. No metric that could measure the weight of a creature's refusal to accept defeat. The young Vectri commander stared at Alara for a long moment, his compound eyes reflecting her bloody and broken form, his mandibles clicking in a rhythm that seemed to be calculating odds he did not like then. Slowly, his rifle began to lower one by one. The other Vectri soldiers followed his lead, their weapons dropping to their sides as they stepped away from the hostages. "We go," the commander said, his translated voice barely above a whisper. "We take wounded, we go." Alara nodded once, her expression showing nothing but cold determination. Smart choice. She stepped aside and watched as the 12 Vectri collected their fallen comrades and made their way down the stairs, moving quickly as if they expected her to change her mind at any moment. Not one of them turned their back to her until they had reached the ruined entrance, and then they were gone, disappearing into the darkness of the facility's corridors, their clicking footsteps fading until silence returned to the arena. Lara stood at the top of the stairs for 3 more seconds, making absolutely sure that the threat had passed. Then her legs gave out and she collapsed against the observation deck railing, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of everything her body had been screaming at her for the last 15 minutes, but she was smiling as she fell because she had won. Galactic Union security forces arrived 43 minutes after the Vectri had fled, their transport ships filling the sky above the facility with lights that cut through the darkness like small suns. By then, Alara had managed to release the examiners from their restraints and had administered the counteragent for the sedative gas that she had found in the arena's emergency medical kit. The Mandari examiner had been the first to wake, her 4 eyes blinking in confusion as she tried to understand why she was lying on the floor of the observation deck, surrounded by the aftermath of a battle. The Thornaki representative had woken next, his 6 arms immediately reaching for weapons that were not there until Alara had calmly explained that the threat had passed. The crystalline Accord member had taken the longest to recover, their living glass body flickering with uncertain light as they processed the chemical agents that had rendered them unconscious. and through it all, Vorithkas had watched from his position against the wall, his cracked scale slowly beginning to heal as his ancient body worked to repair the damage it had sustained. He had tried to help Alara tend to the others, but she had waved him off with a tired smile and told him to rest, that she had everything under control. She had said this while standing on a leg that was still bleeding, with a shoulder that had stopped hurting because the nerves were too damaged to send signals anymore, with ribs that ground against each other every time she breathed. He had seen soldiers with a fraction of her injuries refuse to move until they were carried to medical facilities. And here she was acting as if her wounds were minor inconveniences rather than potentially life-threatening conditions. When the security forces finally breached the facility, they found a scene that none of them had been trained to expect: 18 Vecthory casualties scattered across the arena floor. 4 high-ranking examiners recovering from sedation in the observation deck. 1 badly injured Silverine sitting against a cracked wall. And a single human woman who should not have been standing but was standing anyway, the security commander. A massive Thornaki with service medals covering his chest armor approached Alara with the careful steps of someone who was not sure what they were dealing with. "Cadet Vance," he said, his translator rendering his rumbling voice into careful English. "We received an automated distress signal from this facility approximately 1 hour ago and came as quickly as we could." He looked around at the destruction, at the bodies, at the blood. "Can you tell me what happened here?" Alara opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, Vorithkas pushed himself away from the wall and stepped forward. "I can tell you what happened," the ancient Silverine said, his voice carrying the weight of 400 years of authority. "This facility was attacked by Vecthory Reavers, who breached our security systems and incapacitated the examination committee." He gestured toward Alara with one clawed hand. This human, alone and injured from the combat trial she had just completed, killed 18 of the attackers and forced the remaining 12 to retreat, saving the lives of everyone in this facility. The security commander's eyes widened, and he turned to look at Alara with an expression that combined disbelief and respect in equal measure. "Is this true?" he asked. Alara shrugged, and then winced as the movement sent pain shooting through her damaged shoulder. "More or less," she said, "though I think Examiner Vorithkas is being generous with the details." "I'm not," Vorithkas said firmly. "I witnessed everything that happened after I regained consciousness, and I have never seen anything like it in all my years of service." He turned to face the other examiners, who had gathered at the top of the observation deck stairs and were listening to the conversation with expressions of shock and confusion. "I believe we need to discuss the results of Cadet Vance's combat trial," he announced. The Mandari examiner shook her head, her 4 eyes blinking rapidly. "The trial ended when you announced her failure," she said. "What happened after cannot be considered part of the official assessment." "I agree," Vorithkas replied, and something in his tone made everyone fall silent. "The combat trial ended when I announced her failure, and by our current standards, she did fail because she sustained injuries during the assessment." He paused and looked at Alara with an expression that she could not quite read. "But what happened after the trial has forced me to reconsider whether our current standards are adequate to assess certain species." The crystalline examiner's body flickered with surprised light. "What are you suggesting?" they asked. "I am suggesting that our combat classifications are based entirely on physical metrics," Vorithkas said. "We measure strength and speed and durability and reflexes, and we use those measurements to determine which species are suitable for military integration." He gestured toward the arena floor, toward the evidence of Alara's impossible victory. "By every metric we currently use, humans are unremarkable at best and fragile at worst, and our assessments have consistently rated them as unfit for combat roles. And you are suggesting we change those assessments the Thornaki examiner asked. His 6 arms folded across his massive chest. I am suggesting that we were measuring the wrong things. Vorithka said, I watched this human fight tonight, and she was slower than the Vecthory, and weaker than the Vecthory, and far more easily damaged than the Vecthory. He paused, and she won anyway, because she possesses something that our classification system does not account for. And what is that? The Mandari asked Vorithkas, looked at Alara for a long moment before answering the refusal to stop. He said simply, no matter how much damage she took, no matter how badly the odds were stacked against her, she would not stop fighting until the threat was eliminated. He turned back to the other examiners. I have fought beside members of dozens of species in my 4 centuries of service, and I have never encountered anything like what I saw tonight. And I believe that makes humans worthy of a classification that we do not currently have. The observation deck fell silent as the examiners considered his words. It was the crystalline examiner who finally spoke, their voice resonating through their glass body like a bell. What would you call this classification? They asked. Vorithkas considered the question carefully before answering. In the Silverine language, we have a word for creatures that pursue their prey beyond all reason, that continue hunting long after any sensible predator would have given up. His translator clicked as it searched for an equivalent in English. The closest translation would be something like those who do not stop, or the unending. Alara smiled despite her exhaustion, despite the pain that was finally starting to overwhelm her ability to ignore it. We have a word for that too, she said quietly. Vorithkas tilted his head. What is it? She met his eyes, and in her gaze he saw the same fire that had terrified 30 armed pirates into retreat. Human, she said. The security commander cleared his throat. If the examination committee has no objections, I believe Cadet Vance requires immediate medical attention. Alara wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she was fine, but her body had finally decided that it had tolerated enough abuse for one night. Her legs gave out for the 2nd time, and she would have fallen if Vorithkas had not caught her with his clawed hands. Get her to the medical bay, the ancient Silverine ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. And contact Earth's military command. Tell them that their application for military integration will be reviewed by the full committee at the earliest possible date. As the security officers carefully lifted Alara onto a stretcher, she looked up at Vorithkas with eyes that were starting to lose focus. Does this mean we passed? She asked. Vorithkas looked down at the human who had changed everything. He thought he knew about strength and weakness and what it truly meant to be a warrior. It means that we finally understand what we were looking at, he replied. And I suspect the galaxy will never look at your species the same way again. Alara smiled one last time before unconsciousness finally claimed her. A smile of triumph and exhaustion, and the satisfaction of knowing that she had done what 9 previous attempts had failed to do. She had shown them what humans were, and the stars would remember.